Prologue: The Voice of Thunder. The 19th century was a century of noise-off machines pounding in the factories, of locomotives screaming through the countryside, of parliaments roaring with rhetoric. Yet among all that din, there rose a voice unlike any other, deep, gravelly, and uncompromising, as though some ancient prophet had been resurrected and let loose upon Victorian London. This was Thomas Carlyle, a man who did not so much write as thunder, who did not so much speak as roar, whose sentences struck like hammers against the iron of complacent thought. To his admirers, he was the conscience of the age, the stern prophet calling a restless society back to discipline, to work, to reverence. To his enemies, he was a tyrant in words, a reactionary whose fiery vision sought to bend history itself to his will. Imagine him, walking the smoky streets of Chelsea, his figure tall and angular, wrapped in an old coat that seemed to creak with the weight of his contempt for modern frivolity. His eyes piercing, restless good wither an audience. His presence unsettled even the proudest lords and scholars. For Carlyle carried with him an aura of inevitability, as though every word he spoke came not from himself, but from some thunderous authority beyond the veil of time. He was not merely a writer, he was a force of nature. And yet, within that tempest burned contradictions. Here was a man who loathed democracy, who railed against the chaos of the masses, yet who preached compassion for the poor crushed under the new engines of industry. Here was a thinker who exalted heroes and kings, yet lived like an austere hermit, often tortured by doubt and solitude. He denounced the idleness of modern men, but in his own house was accused of cruelty and coldness, especially by the woman who shared his life, Jane Welsh, whose letters would one day reveal the shadows of that marriage. The paradox of Thomas Carlyle lies not only in his philosophy, but in his very being. He stood at the crossroads of a century that celebrated progress and democracy, yet he scorned both. He thundered against modernity, yet he was its creation, its necessary adversary, the dark mirror in which Victorians saw their own contradictions reflected. His works dense, stormy, at times impenetrable, were read like scripture by those hungry for guidance in an era of upheaval. His critics called him the sage of Chelsea, half in reverence, half in mockery. And so, our story begins not with a quiet scholar, but with a prophet of fire, a man who believed history was no mere march of dates and facts, but a battlefield of souls, where only the strong, the disciplined, the heroic could endure. To understand Carlyle is to descend into a furnace. There is light, yes, but there is also heat enough to scorch. He will be born in the humblest of cottages, molded by a faith that both sustained and tormented him. He will rise, falter, rail against the very tides of his century. And in his triumphs and failures, he will leave behind not only books, but questions about power, about morality, about the very destiny of nations. Before we journey to Ecclefechan, the Scottish village where he first drew breath, we must hold fast to one truth. Carlyle was no ordinary man of letters. He was, for better or worse, a storm given human form. Austere beginnings in Ecclefechan. Ecclefechan, a name as rugged as the soil it clings to, a village of low cottages and stubborn wind in the southern hills of Scotland. It was here on December 4th, 1795, that Thomas Carlyle was born into a world of Presbyterian austerity and unyielding discipline. His father, James Carlyle, was a stonemason, a man of iron will and iron hands, whose chisels carved not only stone but also the moral backbone of his household. His mother, Margaret Aitken, was devout, tender in her own stern way, a figure who carried the Psalms in her heart and pressed them, silently but firmly, into the minds of her children. The Carlyle home was small, dim, its walls cold in the Scottish winter, warmed only by the fire of faith and the relentless toil of its inhabitants. There were no luxuries, no idle pleasures. The rhythm of life was work, prayer, and the eternal struggle against want. To be born in such a place was to be branded from the start with the twin seals of poverty and piety. For Thomas, it meant that every comfort had to be earned, every thought had to be weighed against eternity. From his earliest days, the boy was described as intense thin, pale, with eyes that seemed too large for his face, as though already straining to see beyond the boundaries of the visible world. He listened with awe to his father's stern declarations, to the pulpit thunder of Calvinist preachers who spoke of sin, salvation, and damnation. Religion was not simply doctrine and ecclefechan. It was atmosphere, the air one breathed. Every choice was eternal. Every deed judged by a God whose gaze missed nothing. For young Carlyle, this did not inspire peace, it inspired fire. The village itself mirrored this severity. Ecclefechan was no bustling town, but a place of hard labor and silence, where men rose before dawn to plow the land and women stitched endurance into every garment. Funerals were as common as weddings, and the cemetery on the hill reminded the young that life was brief, frail, and weighed upon by judgment. Such an environment might crush a lesser child into meekness, but in Carlyle it forged a restless hunger, a need to understand, to rebel, to seek truth beyond the rigid forms of his inheritance. The father, James, left an indelible mark. Carlyle would later describe him as the most honest man he had ever known, a man whose strength and simplicity were worth more than all the books in the British Museum. Yet this honesty came wrapped in harshness. There was little patience for weakness, no tolerance for indulgence. The boy grew up under a gaze that measured him against eternal standards of virtue, and it carved into him a lifelong severity towards himself, towards others, towards the age in which he lived. And so, in that tiny Scottish village, between the hammer of faith and the anvil of poverty, the future prophet of history was forged. Already restless, already aflame, Carlyle's mind began to grow beyond the boundaries of his birthplace. He would carry ecclefechan with him always, its soil in his bones, its sermons in his sentences, its stern ghosts echoing in every thunderous page he would one day write. And an academy, the boy out of place. At the age of 10, Thomas Carlyle was sent from the narrow lanes of ecclefechan to the broader, harsher world of Annan Academy. The journey was not far in miles, but for the boy it was an exile, a crossing from the stern shelter of his family's faith into an environment that seemed cold, hostile, and alien. The academy was no sanctuary of learning. It was a proving ground, a place where sharp elbows and sharper tongues defined the hierarchy as much as books and lessons. Here, Carlyle stood apart. His accent marked him, his rustic manner separated him, and his seriousness placed a gulf between himself and other boys who delighted in sport, jest, and mischief. Thin, awkward, wrapped in clothes that spoke more of necessity than style, he became a target for ridicule. The jeers of classmates, the isolation of the schoolyard, all cut deep into the already sensitive spirit of the child. In these early humiliations, a pattern was set. Carlyle would always feel himself at war with the crowd, misunderstood, out of place, forced to rely not on fellowship, but on his own burning resolve. Yet amid the cruelty, there was refuge, the books. Latin and Greek poured into his mind, and the languages became both weapon and sanctuary. The boy's memory was extraordinary. He could recite passages with ease, his mind storing knowledge as a miser hoards gold. Mathematics, too, beckoned him with its stern logic, a discipline as severe and exacting as the moral order of his father's faith. Carlyle found solace in the certainty of numbers, in the clean architecture of Euclid's propositions, even as human society seemed muddy and cruel. But Annan left scars that no book could mend. The loneliness he endured there, the sense of being mocked and despised, grew into a lifelong suspicion of crowds, of institutions, of the so-called wisdom of the many. In later years, when he thundered against democracy and the anarchy of masses, he was in part still speaking as the boy mocked in the schoolyard, mistrusting the collective and searching instead for strength in the solitary, the heroic, the exceptional. Teachers, however, glimpsed his talent. They saw the intelligence blazing behind the awkward frame, and though Carlyle never felt embraced, he was not ignored. His abilities earned him notice, enough to point him toward a path beyond the confines of Annan. His family, poor though they were, recognized that the boy's mind was a gift that could not be left to wither in stonework or farm labor. The academy was meant to prepare him for something greater, and so it did, though at a cost. For Carlyle, Annan was both crucible and curse. It sharpened his intellect, widened his horizons, and drove him deeper into study, but also deepened his solitude, hardened his suspicion of the world, and filled his soul with a bitterness that would never entirely leave him. In that classroom, with chalk dust and Latin declensions, the prophet of history was still only a boy wounded, restless, already burning with the sense that he was marked for something other than the common lot of men. Edinburgh University, dreams and disillusions. At 14 in age, when most boys were still tethered to childish games, Thomas Carlyle entered the gates of Edinburgh University. The capital was a different world from Annan and infinitely distant from the narrow poverty of Ecclefechan. Here were great stone buildings, professors in their gowns, and libraries heavy with the wisdom of centuries. For Carlyle, it was at once a promise of liberation and a burden almost too heavy to bear. He enrolled first with the intent of training for the ministry. For what else could a serious Scottish boy of his background pursue? His parents, devout and ambitious for their gifted son, dreamed of him ascending the pulpit, thundering sermons in the manner of the prophets they revered. And for a time, Thomas tried to believe in that destiny. He studied divinity, mathematics, philosophy. He mastered languages, delved into the ancients, and absorbed the rigor of Scottish Enlightenment thinking that still echoed in Edinburgh's lecture halls. But beneath the surface, doubts began to gnaw. The Calvinist God of his childhood stern, all-seeing, implacably no longer spoke with the same authority. Carlyle wrestled with the problem of faith, the silence of heaven, the terrifying possibility that the universe might be without moral anchor. This was no casual questioning. It was an agony. In later recollections, he would speak of nights when he felt himself on the brink of madness, clawing at the very walls of existence for answers. He was young, brilliant, and adrift in a cosmos that seemed suddenly godless. His studies in mathematics gave him some temporary stability. Numbers, at least, did not lie. Euclid's proofs were eternal. But logic could not feed the soul, nor could it soothe the hunger Carlyle felt for meaning. He began to consume German literature and philosophy, stumbling upon the works of Goethe, Schiller, and Schlegel. In them he discovered a different voice, romantic, visionary, infused with imagination rather than rigid doctrine. The German idealists whispered to him that truth could be sought not only in scripture, but in art, poetry, and the heroic will of man. Yet Edinburgh was not paradise. The young Carlyle lived frugally, often miserably, in shabby lodgings where cold gnawed at his bones and hunger was a familiar guest. He walked miles through the damp streets with threadbare shoes, carrying books borrowed and returned, all while wrestling with the dual burdens of poverty and existential despair. The university gave him tools, but it did not give him peace. At the close of his years in Edinburgh, Carlyle found himself at a crossroads. The ministry, once his presumed path, had become impossible. He could not, with honesty, preach a gospel he no longer believed. But what alternative existed? He had no wealth, no patronage, no clear career. Only one thing remained certain. He was possessed by a restless need to know, to write, to speak with the authority he once attributed to the preachers of his childhood. The pulpit was lost, but another pulpit, the written word, was waiting. The struggle of faith and doubt. For most men, the crisis of faith is a passing storm. For Thomas Carlyle, it became a lifelong tempest. In the years after Edinburgh, when his peers stepped into the certainties of profession and parish, Carlyle drifted in a haze of doubt, gnawed by questions that refused resolution. The God of his childhood had receded into silence. The heavens, once brimming with judgment and grace, felt empty, vast, indifferent. He was left to stare into what he called the everlasting no, the abyss of meaninglessness. It was during these years that Carlyle endured his infamous spiritual crisis. He later described it as a time of terror and paralysis, when every thought led him deeper into despair. He wrestled with the question, if the old faith was dead, what could replace it? Without God, what compass guided the soul? The void seemed to mock him, whispering of futility, of life as mere accident. Many nights he walked alone in the Scottish mist, a gaunt figure pressed by inner demons, convinced he might break under the weight of his own thoughts. Yet out of this darkness there flickered something like revelation. Carlyle spoke of one particular morning when, after nights of torment, he rose from bed with a strange, defiant clarity. He declared to himself that if the universe offered no guidance, then he would provide his own. He would live not by the promise of heaven or the fear of hell, but by sheer strength of will. Produce, produce, he later thundered in his writings, echoing the vow he made to himself. Work would be his gospel, labor his sacrament, and truth, however uncertain, would be pursued not through passive belief, but through active struggle. This was not a gentle resolution. It was an act of rebellion. Carlyle's faith in doctrine collapsed, but in its ruins he forged a harsher creed. He came to believe that man must seize meaning, carve it from chaos, impose it by effort. The spiritual wound never truly healed. He would remain, to his last days, a man haunted by silence. But out of that haunting was born the Carlylean vision, life as duty, as battle, as ceaseless toil under the eye of eternity, whether or not eternity spoke back. The crisis gave him language. In his later works, the fiery cadences, the apocalyptic tones, the obsession with heroes, and strength, all these were echoes of that youthful wrestling with the abyss. He became, in essence, a prophet without a god, a preacher whose gospel was carved out of despair. What others saw as fanaticism was, at its core, the residue of those nights of doubt, when Carlyle faced nothingness and swore to defy it. First steps as a writer: translation and teaching. Adrift after abandoning the ministry, Carlyle turned to the two things that remained faithful to him: knowledge and the written word. Yet these early years were anything but glorious. He scraped together a living as a private tutor, trudging from household to household, instructing young men who often had neither his hunger nor his discipline. Teaching provided bread, but not fulfillment. Each day spent drilling Latin conjugations or Euclidean propositions into half-interested pupils left him restless, impatient, yearning for a higher calling. But even in these drab duties, Carlyle discovered opportunities. While tutoring, he began to write essays, sketches, translations. He immersed himself in German literature, which at the time was almost a hidden world to English readers. Goethe, Schiller, Jean-Paul, voices brimming with imagination and metaphysical daring captivated him. Their works seemed to offer what the Bible no longer could: visions of meaning, not in dogma, but in the creative power of the human spirit. Carlyle became not merely a student of German thought, but its missionary in Britain. Translation became his first stage. With painstaking labor, he rendered the words of Schiller into English, introducing a new audience to the grandeur of German drama. Later, his translations of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship brought him into the orbit of romantic intellectuals who sensed in this young Scot a rare gift. Through Goethe, especially, Carlyle glimpsed a model of how literature could be more than entertainment. It could be spiritual guidance, philosophy in the garb of art. At the same time, he wrote essays for journals, pieces that bore already the thunderous rhythms that would later define his style. Though few paid him much notice, the seeds were planted. He wrote of literature as revelation, of work as salvation, of the soul's struggle as the true battlefield of history. Even in these early ventures, his voice was not that of a quiet scholar, but of a man possessed by urgency. Yet the rewards were meager. Money was scarce, recognition rarer still. Carlyle's life in these years was marked by long walks in solitude, shabby lodgings, gnawing doubts, and a sense that the world had little place for him. But the act of writing itself sustained him. With every essay, Every translation, he was carving a path out of obscurity. His pen, though not yet mighty, had begun to strike. Teaching, meanwhile, sharpened his disdain for mediocrity. Surrounded by students who squandered their privilege, he grew more convinced that society's salvation lay not in the mass, but in the exceptional, the heroic. Already the outlines of his philosophy took shape: a gospel of labor, a suspicion of democracy, an exaltation of great souls. These convictions, born in classrooms and study chambers, would one day shake an empire. The marriage with Jane Welsh, a pact of fire. If Thomas Carlyle's mind was a storm, then Jane Welsh was both its lightning rod and its mirror. Their marriage in 1826 was not a romance in the gentle, sentimental sense. It was a collision of two fierce intelligences, two wills unwilling to yield, bound together by admiration, necessity, and something like love, though often twisted by pain. Jane was brilliant, witty, and far more socially adept than Thomas. Where he brooded in solitude, she sparkled in conversation. Her letters, sharp and lively, reveal a woman of wit and insight who might, under different circumstances, have become a writer of renown herself. Instead, she chose to tie her fate to Carlyle, drawn by his intellect, perhaps even his torment, but soon imprisoned by the very force that had attracted her. Their life together was a paradox. Jane encouraged and supported Thomas, endured his endless hours of labor, his volcanic moods, his obsessions. She managed their household first in Edinburgh, then in the isolated Cragen-Puttock farm, and later in Chelsea, often with patience, sometimes with bitter irony. She believed in his genius, even when the world did not. Without her, Sartor Resartus and the French Revolution might never have been written. But the cost was heavy. Carlyle was demanding, often cold, incapable of the tenderness she craved. His rages, his ceaseless labor, his contempt for small comforts, all wore upon her spirit. Their correspondence shows a marriage, both intimate and agonized letters that flicker between devotion and despair, sarcasm and tenderness. Carlyle admired her brilliance, but he also wounded her with neglect. Jane longed for affection, while Thomas sought only silence to write. And yet, for all the bitterness, there was fire. They were, in some strange way, equal sparring partners in the battle of life, each sharpening the other's edges. Carlyle himself admitted that Jane's mind was as keen as any he had met, and her companionship, however stormy, anchored him. She, in turn, lived both in the shadow of his genius and in the ashes of her own frustrated ambitions. Their union was less a sanctuary than a furnace, where two souls burned together, sometimes in harmony, often in pain. Later generations would argue, was Jane a martyr to Carlyle's ego, or his indispensable partner? The truth, as with so much in Carlyle's life, lies in contradiction. The marriage was not a romance of peace, but a Phrygian alliance forged in intellect, endurance, and suffering, and destined to leave scars on them both. Cragen-Puttock, the remote fortress. Far from the bustle of Edinburgh, and still farther from the smoke of London, there lies a lonely farm in Dumfriesshire, Cragen-Puttock. In 1828, Thomas and Jane Carlyle withdrew there, choosing exile over society, austerity over comfort. To outsiders it seemed folly, two gifted minds retreating into the barren uplands, surrounded by moor and mist. But to Carlyle, Cragen-Puttock was no prison. It was a fortress of silence, a crucible in which his true voice could be forged. The landscape itself mirrored his inner condition. Wild, desolate, swept by winds that seemed to carry the echoes of eternity, it provided the stage upon which he wrestled with despair and hammered out words of fire. Here he began the work that would first mark him as something other than a translator or esse Sartor Resartus, that strange, unclassifiable book, half satire, half metaphysical sermon, clothed in Germanic eccentricity. Life at Cragen-Puttock was severe. Jane, accustomed to livelier society, found herself managing the household in solitude, her wit wasted on the sheep and the hills. The isolation gnawed at her, and her letters from this time are laced with irony, complaint, and flashes of despair. Yet she remained steadfast, supporting Carlyle's labors even as they tested her patience and health. Their marriage, already a battleground, became in these years an endurance test. For Thomas, however, the remoteness was fuel. In the silence of amours, he shaped a philosophy born of both suffering and defiance. The daily toil of tending the land, the endless walks through fog and heather, the bitter cold that seeped into the stone walls all became metaphors in his writing. The world, he declared, was not a place of comfort but of struggle, where man must clothe himself in new garments of meaning, must carve order from chaos. It was during these years that Emerson, across the Atlantic, first encountered Carlyle's writings. Their ensuing correspondence blossomed into one of the great intellectual friendships of the century. Emerson would become Carlyle's champion in America, spreading his reputation when Britain remained indifferent. Cragen Puttock, isolated though it was, became the unlikely birthplace of an international voice. And yet, the cost was real. Jane's spirit withered in that barren solitude, and even Carlyle's health faltered under the strain. By 1834, they would abandon the moorland fortress for London, seeking a new stage. But Cragen Puttock remained forever etched in Carlyle's legend, the lonely stronghold where a prophet, half mad with silence, first clothed his doubts in words that would shake an empire. Sartor Resartus, a book nobody understood. In 1834, from the cold solitude of Cragen Puttock, there emerged a book unlike anything the English-speaking world had ever seen. Sartor Resartus, the tailor retailered was its strange title, and within its pages Thomas Carlyle poured not only his philosophy, but the very essence of his spiritual torment. It was not a novel, not a treatise, not satire, not sermon, but all of these at once. To read, it was to enter a labyrinth where German metaphysics mingled with Scottish thunder, where the plight of a fictional professor of things in general became a vessel for Carlyle's own wrestling with faith, meaning, and the void. The book was, in truth, a veiled autobiography. Beneath its eccentric form lay Carlyle's journey through the everlasting no of despair to the defiant, everlasting yeah of self-willed faith. The hero, Professor Diogenes Teufelsdrockh, was a mask behind which Carlyle revealed his own soul. The nights of terror, the rejection of old dogma, the discovery that work and duty were the only sure anchors in a world adrift. It was wild, dense, often incomprehensible, and yet pulsing with a fire that no reader could mistake. But when Sartor Resartus first appeared, Britain did not know what to make of it. Editors hesitated, readers scoffed. To the practical, commerce-driven society of early Victorian London, Carlyle's prophetic cries sounded like the ravings of a lunatic. "What is this book?" they asked. Was it a parody of German philosophy, or a philosophy itself? Was it profound or absurd? To most, it was unintelligible. In America, however, the book found champions. Ralph Waldo Emerson, already in correspondence with Carlyle, hailed it as the voice of a new scripture, a gospel for a restless age. Published in Boston, it stirred the transcendentalists, who saw in Carlyle a kindred spirit, a prophet who dared to wrestle with ultimate questions. Across the Atlantic, the obscure Scotsman became a figure of reverence, while in Britain he remained an eccentric on the margins. Yet Sartor was a seed. Its strange form and fiery tone announced that Carlyle was no mere translator, no minor essayist. He had found his voice, and though his own country scoffed, he would not be silenced. In its pages lay the essence of his creed: life as battle, work as salvation, history as the drama of souls. What Britain dismissed, Carlyle knew was revelation. Years later, critics would return to Sartor Resartus and see in it the foundation of his later thunder. At the time, however, it was a book nobody understood, a riddle shouted into the void, awaiting the moment when the world would be ready to listen. Part 10. London Arrival. Into the furnace of the metropolis. In 1834, Thomas Carlyle and Jane left the bleak moors of Craigengputtock behind and descended into the roaring heart of the British Empire, London. If Craigengputtock had been a crucible of silence, Chelsea became a furnace of noise, ambition, and ceaseless motion. London was the largest city on earth, swollen with factories, carts, shouting crowds, the reek of coal smoke and poverty pressed against the grandeur of wealth. For Carlyle, it was both a torment and a stage the very chaos he despised, and yet the arena that would finally magnify his voice. They settled at 24 Cheyne Row, a modest house in Chelsea, which would become both Carlyle's fortress and his prison for nearly half a century. From its small study, filled with papers, pens, and his volcanic temper, he would hurl his thunder upon the world. The house itself was unremarkable, but within those walls history was rewritten, one furious page at a time. London overwhelmed him at first. The endless carriages rattling, the shrieks of vendors, the filth of overcrowded alleys all seemed to Carlyle the very image of mechanical society, soulless, degraded, spinning toward anarchy. He detested the age of cash nexus, of greed without reverence. Yet he also recognized that only in London could he seize the ear of the powerful. Only there could his words cut through the din and strike the conscience of a nation. The intellectual circles of the capital soon took notice. Carlyle, awkward in company, brusque, with his heavy Scots accent and uncompromising manner, did not charm easily. But he commanded attention. Writers, politicians, and thinkers drifted toward Cheyne Row, drawn by the force of his personality. Among them were Dickens, Mill, and Ruskinson in admiration, others in wary fascination. Carlyle did not seek popularity. He demanded respect, and more often than not, he compelled it. For Jane, London offered a bittersweet reprieve from Craigengputtock solitude. Here she found society, salons, the company of sharp minds, and lively conversations. Yet she also bore the burden of managing Carlyle's moods, his relentless demands for silence as he wrote, his impatience with the trivialities of domestic life. Their marriage, already tested, grew more strained in the crucible of the metropolis. Still, London became the stage upon which Carlyle's destiny would unfold. The moors had given him his voice, but it was the metropolis that gave him an audience. In the furnace of London, amid its squalor and splendor, he would soon create the work that transformed him from eccentric prophet to national figure. The fiery chronicle of a world turned upside down the French Revolution. The French Revolution, triumph from ashes. The work that would propel Carlyle from obscurity into the firmament of Victorian letters began in catastrophe. In the early 1830s, he was commissioned to write a history of the French Revolution, a task that both thrilled and terrified him. Here was the ultimate drama of modern times. Kings toppled, mobs surging, thrones overturned, guillotines dripping. It was chaos incarnate, the very embodiment of the anarchy Carlyle believed haunted his own century. If he could capture it, he would prove himself not merely a thinker, but a historian of prophetic power. He labored furiously, filling page after page with his volcanic prose. But in a twist worthy of the Revolution itself, disaster struck. John Stuart Mill, a friend who had borrowed the manuscript to read, left it in the hands of a careless servant. Believing the pages to be waste paper, she used them to kindle a fire. In one night, months of Carlyle's agonized labor were reduced to ash. The devastation was nearly unbearable. Carlyle, already prone to despair, felt cursed. Yet Jane urged him on, reminding him of his duty to his genius, and so he began again. With grim determination, he rewrote the book from memory, sentence by sentence, image by image, each page hammered out with the fury of a man defying fate itself. The second draft was not merely a repetition. It was forged in fire, sharpened by loss. When the French Revolution, a history, appeared in 1837, it was unlike any history book the English public had ever encountered. Carlyle wrote not as a chronicler of facts, but as a prophet of apocalypse. His sentences leapt and burned. His chapters surged like storm waves. He did not dissect events. She flung the reader into the streets of Paris, amid the mob, under the shadow of the guillotine. History, in his hands, became drama, prophecy, nightmare. The reception was electric. Some readers were bewildered, but others were enthralled. Dickens called it a masterpiece, and it would later inspire him to write a tale of two cities. Even those who disagreed with Carlyle's politics could not ignore the power of his vision. Overnight, the obscure Scot became a name on every tongue. This sage of Chelsea, the thunderer who had turned history into revelation. From the ashes of his manuscript rose the book that defined him. The French Revolution was more than history. It was a warning, a vision of what happens when society loses reverence, when order collapses into chaos. Carlyle had not merely described the pas, had sounded a trumpet to his own age. On heroes, hero worship, and the heroic in history, vision of power. By the early 1840s, Thomas Carlyle had become more than a writer. He was a voice that Victorian England could not ignore. His lectures, delivered in the hushed halls of London, drew audiences eager and, sometimes fearful, to hear the prophet of Chelsea thunder against the complacencies of their age. Out of these lectures emerged one of his most famous works, On Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic in History, 1841. In this book, Carlyle proclaimed what he saw as the engine of history. Not institutions, not economics, not the anonymous mass of humanity, but the great individual, the hero. The history of the world, he declared, is but the biography of great men. It was a creed that cut against the democratic tide of his century, yet it rang with a brutal clarity. Where others saw progress in parliaments and markets, Carlyle saw only chaos, unless guided by figures of strength, vision, and will. His heroes came in many forms. Odin, the mythic seer, Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, Dante and Shakespeare, poets who shaped the soul of nations, Luther, the reformer, Cromwell, the soldier of faith. To Carlyle, each was a vessel through which truth had blazed, shaping history not through compromise, but through sheer force of character. It was not democracy, but destiny that mattered, the destiny embodied in such towering figures. Audiences were electrified, even when scandalized. Some heard in Carlyle's words an antidote to the mediocrity of their age, a call to revere greatness. Others recoiled, sensing in his exaltation of power a dangerous contempt for liberty and equality. Yet no one could mistake the urgency of his vision. Carlyle was not merely theorizing. He was prophesying. In a century that prided itself on progress, he warned of decay, unless guided by men of iron. The lectures secured his fame. He was now firmly established as the sage of Chelsea, his house on Cheyne Row becoming a kind of intellectual shrine where disciples, admirers, and critics alike gathered. Politicians listened, even if uneasily. Writers debated him, often in his own terms. To the Victorians, who lived amid both the triumph of empire and the anxieties of social upheaval, Carlyle offered a voice at once archaic and terrifyingly modern. On Heroes crystallized the essence of his creed: reverence for strength, disdain for weakness, belief in history as moral struggle. It was both scripture and provocation, elevating Carlyle to a figure as feared as he was admired. And in its echoes, one can hear the boy from Annan Academy mocked, isolated, defiant now, standing before the world, demanding that it bow not to the crowd, but to the hero. Victorian celebrity, admired and feared. By the mid-1840s, Thomas Carlyle was no longer the obscure, struggling tutor or the eccentric translator of German metaphysics. He was a force. The lectures, the stormy prose of the French Revolution, the thunder of On Heroes all had propelled him into the heart of Victorian cultural life. His reputation was both exalted and unsettling. To some, he was the conscience of the age. To others, its most dangerous reactionary. London society came to Cheyne Row as though on pilgrimage. Politicians, writers, and intellectuals passed through the modest Chelsea home, eager to see the prophet for themselves. Among them were Dickens, who admired Carlyle's fiery vision, Mill, with whom he quarreled as often as he conversed, and Ruskin, who absorbed Carlyle's gospel of work into his own art and social critique. Even statesmen listened uneasily, for while Carlyle despised the parliamentary system, he nevertheless commanded the attention of those who governed it. But Carlyle was not a comfortable guest. His manner was brusque, his Scots accent thick, his temper volcanic. He scorned small talk, dismissed polite courtesies, and launched into tirades against sham and cant, his favorite terms for the hypocrisies of modern life. To encounter him in person was to be both dazzled and bruised, as if one had been caught in the blast of a furnace. The public, too, regarded him with mixed awe and dread. His writings struck chords of moral urgency in an age anxious about industrialization, poverty, and the collapse of old certainties. Yet his contempt for democracy, his exaltation of strength, his sneering dismissal of ballot box anarchy made many uneasy. He seemed at once a prophet and a tyrant, a voice calling the age to repentance, and a warning of what might come if such a voice gained actual power. For Jane, fame was a double-edged sword. The visitors, the correspondence, the endless demands on her husband's time meant constant activity, but it also intensified the strain of their marriage. She managed the house, entertained guests, and shielded Carlyle from practical concerns, all while her own health and spirit withered. She was the unsung architect of his celebrity, even as she bore the hidden cost of it. Carlyle himself accepted fame without humility and without comfort. Admiration fed his conviction that he was chosen to speak for the age, but he remained restless, bitter, unsatisfied. He wanted not applause, but transformation. He wanted his words to burn away the hypocrisies of society and leave only truth standing. The louder the world cheered or cursed him, the louder he thundered back. By the height of his celebrity, Carlyle had become something rare, a writer who was both revered and feared, a man whose very presence in Victorian discourse was an event. He was no longer just a historian or philosopher. He was a phenomenon, and in that role, he began to sharpen his creed further, proclaiming a new gospel that was both workmanlike and relentless, the gospel of work. The gospel of work against idleness. Amid the roaring machinery of the Industrial Revolution, when England prided itself on progress, yet trembled at the chaos it bred, Thomas Carlyle raised a new gospel not of salvation through faith, but of salvation through toil. Blessed is he who has found his work, he thundered, let him ask no other blessedness. For Carlyle, work was not merely the means of earning bread. It was the essence of life, the sole antidote to despair, the true communion between man and eternity. This vision, later crystallized in his book Past and Present, 1843, sprang from his horror at the spiritual emptiness of Victorian society. He saw idle aristocrats drowning in luxury, merchants worshipping only profit, and laborers crushed into misery by factories that consumed bodies while starving souls. For Carlyle, both the indolent rich and the exploited poor suffered from the same disease, a loss of reverence for work as duty. In Past and Present, Carlyle juxtaposed medieval monastic discipline with modern industrial chaos. To him, the monks of the Middle Ages embodied the true spirit of labor. Toil performed not for profit but for devotion, work sanctified as service. In contrast, the factories of his own day represented degradation, where men were reduced to cogs in a soulless machine. His book was not nostalgia, but indictment, a trumpet blast demanding that his age rediscover dignity in work, order in chaos, purpose in labor. The message resonated with many Victorians who felt the disorientation of rapid change. Carlyle's fiery rhetoric gave voice to their unease. He called for leaders who could discipline, guide, and inspire not politicians chasing votes, but captains of labor commanding armies of workers with the same reverence monks once offered to God. To him, this was not tyranny, but salvation, a reforging of society through duty and discipline. But not all agreed. Critics saw in Carlyle's gospel a dangerous glorification of authority, a disdain for liberty, a readiness to sacrifice individual rights for collective order. His contempt for laissez-faire economics and democratic governance alienated many liberals. Yet even they could not ignore the moral urgency of his call. Carlyle was no economist, no reformer with practical schemes. He was a prophet demanding that England recover its soul. The gospel of work became one of his enduring legacies. It was both stern and inspiring, a creed forged from his own battles with despair. For Carlyle, who had wrestled with the everlasting no and emerged by sheer force of will, work was the only anchor against the void. To labor, to strive, to discipline oneself, this was life's true prayer. Dark vision of democracy, the anti-modern prophet. As the Victorian age marched deeper into reform, expanding the franchise, celebrating progress, proclaiming liberty, Thomas Carlyle stood apart, thundering his refusal. To him, democracy was not salvation but disaster. He saw in the ballot box not wisdom but chaos, the blind leading the blind. The age hailed the voice of the people as divine. Carlyle heard only the roar of a mob, directionless, destructive, incapable of reverence. He called it the anarchy of laissez-faire, a world in which rulers were chosen not for greatness but for popularity, where greed replaced duty and mediocrity was enthroned as virtue. His writings, especially in works like Chartism, 1839, and later Latter-day Pamphlets, 1850, burned with contempt for political reformers who promised salvation through votes and free trade. Carlyle saw only degradation, workers abandoned to hunger, aristocrats feasting, politicians mouthing platitudes while society disintegrated. Against this, he demanded leadership, true leadership, not the compromise of parliaments, but the command of heroes. He yearned for captains of industry, men who would rule with strength, discipline, and vision, guiding the masses as shepherds guide their flock. To modern ears, his words ring authoritarian, even proto-fascist, but in his own century they were heard as the cry of a prophet unwilling to bow to the dogmas of liberal progress. The contradiction was glaring. Carlyle, who spoke passionately of compassion for the poor, who denounced the soullessness of industrial capitalism, nevertheless placed his faith not in the masses themselves, but in the iron will of exceptional men. He sought justice, but by the hand of the strong. He loathed oppression, yet distrusted freedom. He wanted order at any cost, even if order came dressed in tyranny. His stance scandalized many. Liberals recoiled, reformers denounced him, and even friends winced at his harshness. Yet others, weary of shallow optimism, found in his vision a bracing honesty. Carlyle dared to say what few would admit, that progress was fragile, that democracy might not be salvation, that strength mattered more than sentiment. Thus he became the anti-modern prophet, admired and feared in equal measure. While his contemporaries sang hymns to liberty, Carlyle thundered warnings of chaos. His words, unsettling then, would echo ominously into later centuries, long after his voice had fallen silent. The history of Frederick the Great, monument of will. In the 1850s, when most men of letters would have settled into comfort, Thomas Carlyle embarked on what would become his most exhausting and, in many ways, self-destructive labor, the history of Frederick II of Prussia, called Frederick the Great. It was a project of monumental scale, sprawling across 6 volumes, researched with the obsessive rigor of a man determined to bend centuries into his own fiery vision. Why Frederick? To Carlyle, the Prussian king embodied the very creed he had been preaching for decades: duty, discipline, will. Frederick was no democrat, no sentimentalist. He was a soldier, a leader, a man who carved order from chaos with sword and command. In him, Carlyle saw the hero writ large, the living argument against the mediocrity of parliaments and the compromises of democracy. To tell Frederick's story was, for Carlyle, to vindicate his own philosophy. But the task nearly devoured him. For years, he buried himself in archives, chasing details of battles, maps, correspondence, troop movements. His study at Cheyne Row became a bunker of papers, his days consumed by endless rewriting, his nights haunted by sleeplessness and gastric torment. Jane, already strained by years of neglect, grew more embittered as Carlyle vanished into the labyrinth of Prussian wars. Their home became a battlefield of silence and recrimination, each partner imprisoned by the other's misery. The writing itself was volcanic. Carlyle's prose, already dense, grew heavier, thunderous with moral judgments. He did not merely narrate Frederick's campaigns. He exalted them as acts of destiny. For him, Frederick was not a man, but a force flawed, yes, but chosen to impose order upon a chaotic world. The 6 volumes became not just a history, but a monument, Carlyle's attempt to etch into the 19th century the eternal supremacy of strength. When the work finally appeared, readers were staggered. Some admired its scope, its passion, its sheer intensity. Others recoiled from its authoritarian undertones, its unrelenting glorification of power. But no one could ignore it. The Frederick volumes secured Carlyle's place as one of the century's most formidable historians and also revealed the dark trajectory of his thought. For Carlyle, Frederick was more than a king of the past. He was a model for the future, proof that history bowed, not to crowds or parliaments, but to the will of great men. In celebrating Frederick, Carlyle built not only a monument to Prussia's king, but also to his own creed that cast its shadow over generations yet to come. The collapse of marriage, Jane's anguish. While Carlyle labored over Frederick the Great, his marriage with Jane Welsh had sunk into a state of quiet torment. What had begun as a union of sharp minds and restless spirits had, by the 1850s, hardened into something more brittle, a partnership of endurance, laced with bitterness. The London drawing rooms saw Jane as witty, radiant, full of charm, but within Cheyne Row, her letters reveal a woman worn down by neglect, loneliness, and the endless shadow of her husband's genius. Carlyle, consumed by his work, demanded silence above all else. The scratching of his pen, the thunder of his prose, these mattered more to him than companionship or tenderness. Jane, who had sacrificed her own ambitions for his career, found herself increasingly isolated. She once quipped, half in jest, that she had given her youth and health to be the wife of a man of genius, and what has genius given me in return? Behind the wit lay anguish. Her letters tell of evenings spent alone, of ailments dismissed, of longing for affection unreturned. Visitors to Cheyne Row often remarked on the sharp exchanges between husband and wife, the quick wit that masked deep wounds. Jane's sharpness, her sarcasm, became her shield. Carlyle, too self-absorbed to see clearly, often bristled at her complaints, answering with gruffness rather than warmth. Their home, which should have been a refuge, had become a theater of restraint, where love survived only in fragments. And yet, the bond was not broken. For all the pain, Jane admired Thomas's intellect, even his fire. She managed his household, entertained his guests, and protected his time. Carlyle, for his part, respected her brilliance, though he rarely showed it in words or gestures of tenderness. Their relationship was one of dependency and defiance. Neither could imagine life without the other, yet both felt imprisoned in the marriage they had forged. As Carlyle's fame grew, so too did Jane's sense of being effaced. She wrote to friends of her loneliness, her fading health, her bitterness at being reduced to what she called a mere housekeeper of genius. When she died suddenly in 1866, while riding in her carriage through Hyde Park, Carlyle was shattered. Too late, he realized how deeply he had failed her, how little he had given compared to what she had borne. His reminiscences of Jane Welsh Carlyle, written in grief, read less like tribute than confess I own a man tormented by the memory of his neglect. The collapse of their marriage was not a dramatic rupture, but a long erosion, marked by sharp words, silences, and unfulfilled needs. Jane's anguish remains one of the most haunting shadows in Carlyle's story, a reminder that behind the prophet's thunder, there was a woman whose own brilliance was dimmed, whose love was spent, and whose sorrow became part of the price of his genius. Last years, the prophet in silence. After Jane's sudden death in 1866, Thomas Carlyle was a man broken open. The Thunderer of Chelsea, who had spent decades railing against the age, now found himself adrift in grief and regret. He wandered the empty rooms of Cheyne Row, the silence heavy with the ghost of Jane's wit and laughter. In his reminiscences of Jane Welsh Carlyle, written in fits of anguish, he confessed what he had long denied, that she had suffered, that he had neglected her, that his greatness had come at the expense of her happiness. It was less a eulogy than a lament, an act of penance carved in prose. The years that followed were marked by decline. Carlyle was still honored, still revered by disciples who treated him as the sage of his century, but the fire of creation had dimmed. He had become a relic of an earlier era, out of step with the optimism of late Victorian liberalism. Where others hailed the progress of science, democracy, and empire, Carlyle muttered only of decay and sham. His books had once shaken the conscience of Britain. Now his voice seemed like a storm fading on the horizon. Yet his presence remained formidable. Even in his old age, bent and weary, he carried an aura that unsettled visitors. His eyes still flashed with the old fire, and his sentences, when he chose to speak, still struck like hammer blows. But more often he retreated into silence. He took long